starts. Good afternoon again. Okay, so we're going to continue this agriculture topic, part 3, and as you can see, today we're going to look at greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So we're continuing on this look at these key components that can generate environmental damage, can perturb ecosystems and aquatic organisms due to agricultural practices, particularly intensive agricultural practices. And so today I'm going to cover 3 different greenhouse gases that can be derived from agricultural activities. So it's carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. So unlike the last 2 lectures, I'm not going to say very much, or in fact I'm not really going to say anything at all about the consequences of these greenhouse gas emissions on ecosystems or on biota. As I'm sure you're all aware, accumulation of greenhouse gases, which are a key driver of global warming and change to our climate, can then derive a whole range of multiple activities, which is a whole number of lectures in its own right. So all I'm really going to focus on today are the different mechanisms through agricultural activity that can derive these different greenhouse gases and how we could potentially mitigate some of these emissions. Obviously, just a key component for you to be aware of is, of course, that the increasing accumulation of these gases in our atmosphere do enhance the warming of our planet. So as these gases accumulate, they will absorb radiation and also emit it back to the planet's surface, and they're emitting this as heat principally. So we're having this so-called greenhouse effect, where this accumulation of gases are driving this warming process. And there are various gases that can give rise to this greenhouse effect. And this table just lists some of the key gases that can generate these warming characteristics. And as I say, we're just going to focus on these 3, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, that are relevant to consider from an agricultural context. So there are 2 sets of data here that we might want to be aware of. And this first one in this column on the right is the warming potential derived from these gases. So carbon dioxide is, of course, the key greenhouse gas that we're always made aware of. It's being accumulated in high concentrations in our atmosphere over many decades of human activities, principally industrial activities, fossil fuel burning activities. So, but although carbon dioxide is present in large abundance, all of these gases don't have the same activities. So carbon dioxide is actually less active in terms of its warming potential than some of these other gases. So if we normalise carbon dioxide to a value of 1, so that we can compare these other gases, we find that methane is 25 times more active than carbon dioxide, while nitrous oxide is nearly 300 times more active than carbon dioxide. So although these other 2 gases are present at much lower abundance, they are much more damaging in the sense that they have much greater warming potential. And then the other characteristic here to bear in mind is the persistence of these gases, so the lifetime of these gases. So both carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide have a lifetime of about 100 or so years. So this is obviously important to consider, so that any changes that we make now are going to take a while to actually give rise to change in our atmosphere. So if we were to turn off the tap of carbon dioxide production today, we're not going to see an immediate decline in carbon dioxide. It's the same with nitrous oxide as well, whereas methane has a much shorter lifetime of about 12 years. So this suggests that there might be the potential to make changes to methane emissions, and that's going to have a much faster observed benefit. So if we think about these greenhouse gas emissions, and we also think about them in an agricultural context, we see that agriculture generates about a quarter of these greenhouse gas emissions. And this, as we'll see in a moment, is a combination of the direct activities from agriculture that generate the production of these gases. So this is the about 10 to 12% of these agricultural emissions are from these direct activities, which I'll explain in a minute. And the rest is through land use changes, which I'll also talk about in a minute. In terms of these gases, as we know, the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions are carbon dioxide. This big blue block here is the carbon dioxide emissions from all these utilised fossil fuel industrial activities, where nearly most of these are not agriculture related. But then we also have a large proportion that's due to principally land use changes, and this we are going to touch on in terms of where there's been a major change in land use. So we've talked a lot about the change from, say, forestry to agriculture, or from savannas to agriculture, or drain of wetlands to agriculture. And this, I'll talk more about in a moment, can give rise to carbon emission changes. And then methane and nitrous oxide make up the rest of, or most of the rest of these gases that are emitted, and these are predominantly derived from agricultural sources. So this cartoon just really sort of summarised many of the key concepts I want to talk about today. So we've got various routes by which these three main gases are being emitted into the atmosphere through agricultural activities. It's principally methane and nitrous oxide that are the key gases that are emitted from agriculture, but with some carbon dioxide as well. So there's carbon dioxide emissions that are generated through biological activities. So we're going to look at, I'll touch on these activities such as respiration from organisms in the soil, and also decomposition of plant materials, as well as the kind of more active sources of generation of CO2. So the use of farm machinery, for example, on the agricultural land, the transportation of goods from farm to shop, and transport all over the place as the agricultural logistics become more and more global. And then the sources of these other two gases. So methane that can be generated principally through animal agriculture, and also from rice cultivation, and then nitrous oxide, but is also principally generated through soil microbial activities. So I'll touch on these key components over the next 40 minutes or so. So let's start with CO2. So as I've just said, there's two key components for CO2 emissions. One is the emissions from biological sources, so soil. So when I say soils, I'm principally referring to microbial activities that derive emissions from soils, as well as release of stored carbon from soils, plant and animal respiration, and then we've got land use changes, as I've already said, transportation of these produce. But also a key component to remember is the production of fertiliser. So I've talked a lot about the production of the ammonia-based fertiliser. I mentioned the Haber-Bosch process a couple of times in the last two lectures. And this is a very energy-intensive process. It generates a lot of carbon dioxide in the production of this ammonia fertiliser. So while there's, if you remember from a previous graph in the lecture on last Tuesday, substantial increases in ammonia fertiliser production and input year on year over the last century, this has also driven increased productions of CO2 through the generation of this fertiliser. So when we think about carbon production and carbon cycling, particularly CO2 cycling in an agricultural context, there's while there is the the emissions that take place through use of machinery and these industrial activities such as fertilizer production. The key concept that we're considering is this CO2 cycle. So we've got carbon dioxide that's generated through respiration. So of course we all respire, we all utilise organic material that we acquire through our food, and we break that down to generate energy, and obviously carbon dioxide is a byproduct of that respiration process, and of course all living organisms are doing this process. So in an agricultural context, the plant crops growing in the field, the animals being cultivated in that field are all respiring and producing carbon dioxide, and also the microorganisms and the other invertebrates and animals present in the soil are all respiring. So there's a pool of carbon dioxide that's present from those various living processes, and then at the same time there's capture of CO2 through plant photosynthesis. So obviously there's this balance between the emission through respiration and the accumulation and fixation of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And we can look at this in a bit more detail in this diagram here. And I probably should have called this the plant-soil carbon cycle rather than just the soil carbon cycle, because obviously plants are playing a key role in this initial fixation process. So as we know, plants are acquiring carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, taking it into their leaves, and then that carbon is being fixed into sugars through photosynthetic reactions. You don't need to remember the details of that, but obviously basically the carbon dioxide is being converted via an enzyme, this enzyme Rubisco, into triose sugars, and then those sugars are being converted into various products, some of which in an agricultural context we're harvesting in terms of the grains or the fruits or the vegetables or whatever it is we want to utilise that crop for. So some of that carbon is being used to generate the produce we want to utilise, or then the feed that's going to be used for cultivating the livestock. Obviously some of that carbon is used for plant growth, and then but a proportion of that carbon is going to be secreted out of the plant into the soil. So as I mentioned briefly in the last lecture, a proportion of carbon is secreted out of the roots of the plant and stored in the soil, or is available for use in the soil. And this is what I mean here with regard to these exudates. So this is the term for these carbon compounds that are secreted by the roots. These are principally organic acids or polysaccharides, but are secreted from the roots and are used to attract microbial communities that can play a symbiotic relationship with plants to enhance elemental cycling. And so we have a pool of carbon that's secreted into the soil. In addition, any litter material, so for example leaves that are lost in the plants, they will then start to decompose, and that decomposition will also generate carbon. So this incorporation of carbon from the plant and this breakdown of litter, of course, this is dependent on this microbial activity that's taking place in the soil. So both fungal and bacterial microorganisms are involved in this utilisation of this plant-derived carbon. And a proportion of this carbon is then a stable pool, a more permanent pool within the soil. And I talked about this briefly in the last lecture as well, in terms of a proportion of organic carbon that's present in the soil and plays a key role in the soil in terms of maintaining a nutrient pool, maintaining a water pool, is an indicator of viability of the soil. And knowing or understanding the mechanism by which some of this carbon is sort of laid down in this stable carbon pool in the soil versus the carbon that's then released again into the atmosphere through respiration is a key component to understand in terms of the balance between how much carbon is sequestered in the soil and how much carbon is released. And this stable carbon pool, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, is an important component to consider. And this has actually been quite a challenge to model in terms of being able to exactly quantify how much carbon is stored in our planet's soils and what are the challenges for the release of this carbon. And this change in this soil carbon pool, or this soil organic carbon pool, has been analysed in a number of studies, such as this one here. So this is data from this 2017 paper, where they modelled the changes in this soil carbon pool due to changes in agricultural practice and land use activities. So the top graph is showing the distribution of agricultural activities. So I've shown you a graph similar to this before. So we've got a comparison of the arable agriculture, shown here in red, and the grazing agriculture, shown here in green. And then in the bottom graph, we've got the change in soil carbon release over time. And the red and the yellow colours is showing the loss of carbon over time overlaid with these agricultural activities. And what we find in that regions that are principally arable cultivation regions are the regions that are also driving the greatest loss of carbon from the soils over time. So this is these regions where there's intensive arable agriculture, and we're seeing substantial losses of this soil organic carbon. And then the regions in the yellows and the oranges, these are also showing carbon losses from the soil, but at a slight slower rate, which is better. But obviously the concern here is that these areas are much greater and much more widespread. So although this loss of carbon that are associated more with grazing and animal farming are reduced, they are much greater in area. So they're overall, it's still a substantial loss of carbon. And why is this carbon being lost? Well, I've talked about some of these processes in the last lecture. So it's a combination of land use change as land is being converted from forestry or natural grasslands or wetlands into agricultural lands. A lot of carbon is being lost. So as a forest region is being deforested, a lot of that carbon is being removed from the soil as those trees are being burnt, or those trees and roots and the associated vegetation is being removed out of that soil. Although the organic carbon that's been associated in the soil of those plants is also then quickly lost. I also, if you remember, we talked about the other agricultural activities that also drive erosion of soil and loss of carbon in the soil. So activities like overgrazing, like removal of all crop residues at the end of the season, and active tillage and ploughing activities, which also damage your soil and lead to increased release of carbon. So all of these activities are promoting this loss of this stable organic carbon pool from our planet's soils. So what can we do about this? So a lot of recent modelling has been performed to propose alternative agricultural solutions that could attempt to limit this carbon loss and therefore reverse this change and increase the sequestration of carbon into these soils. So this is one such study that looked at different agricultural practices that could increase carbon sequestration in Europe and European arable soils. So what we have here is a series of maps that model the increases in soil storage that could take place through different agricultural activities, and these bars on this graph then quantify these changes overall. So we've got these different codes here which indicate different agricultural activities. So this first one, which also maps onto this map here, which shows that the greatest sequestration of carbon. This is a change from arable intensive agriculture to more grassland agriculture. And this switch from arable to grassland is proposed to give the greatest change in carbon sequestration. But of course, we can't completely revert all our arable land in Europe to grassland, because of course we need food to be produced to feed the population of Europe. But perhaps where some of that arable land is less productive, there is scope to consider the land use of that land and potentially improve some of the carbon loss from some of that arable land. The other models here, so this one here, RES, this is the concept of not removing crop residues from the field at the end of the season, so leaving those residues on the field, so that carbon that's incorporated in that plant material can enter back into the soil. RT, this is reduced tillage, so reducing this this active movement of the soil through ploughing activities. That can also provide some benefit. RET, this is a combination of both leaving residuals and reduced tillage. And then these last two are different components of crop rotation that have been modelled. So what you can take from this is that there are differences in agricultural practice that can be utilised, that have been shown through this modelling to indeed reverse some of this carbon loss. And this is considered to be quite important to take on board, because if we were to stand still and not do anything, carbon loss from the soil is predicted to increase anyway due to the changes that we are seeing in our climate. So a number of studies, such as this data here, has shown that as our climate warms, as the soils on average warm, this drives greater respiration in the soil, and therefore greater carbon dioxide release from the soil due to this microbial activities. Likewise, decomposition rates have been shown to increase as temperature increases. Other processes that are linked to climate change, so increased drought incidents, increased heavy rainfall, such as what we seem to be seeing at the moment, also increased decomposition rates, also increase mobilisation of carbon from the soil. So this gives rise to this positive feedback. So as these temperature conditions increase, this is driving more carbon dioxide release from the soil. Obviously, then this is fueling more temperature changes, and it's become this positive cyclic change. So therefore, if we are to stay as we are, so if we are to have our carbon input into the soil at a current constant rate, then we will still see a drop in our soil organic carbon over time, as modelled here. This graph is cropland, this graph is grassland, and both models are showing similar patterns. If we were to actually worsen our agricultural activities, if we were to become more intensive, lose more carbon from the soil, so this is the minus 20% carbon input, this loss of this stable organic carbon pool is going to be more rapid over time, as these models suggest. And in fact, only by slowing this carbon loss by about 20%, which is shown by these white triangles here, are we able to pretty much keep this line flat and keep our soil carbon pool as it is at the moment. Of course, just remember, this is obviously modelling based on the current experimental data that we have, based on these soil respiration, decomposition data, and based on our current knowledge of land use change and carbon removal from our current agricultural practices. Okay, so are there opportunities to mitigate some of these challenges? Well, biofuels has been one option that a number of people have promoted and considered as a means to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is being emitted into the atmosphere through the utilisation of fossil fuels. Biofuels, of course, are the generation of alternative energy sources from a biological source, whereby as a plant grows, it's utilising carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. So when when that energy is then utilised, the carbon dioxide that is released is that same carbon dioxide that has just been utilised to grow the biomass. So in theory, it's carbon neutral. And there are different types of biofuels that are currently being cultivated from a plant context. So we have the so-called first generation biofuels. These are the plant products that are being utilised as a fuel source. So we have carbohydrate producing crops, so grains from cereals or sugar from, say, sugarcane, that can be converted into a bioethanol type fuel, or vegetable oils from the likes of palm oil or oilseed rape that can be converted into a biodiesel type fuel. The issues here are the fact that obviously some of this food crop is instead being used for a fuel, so we've got this conflict between this food versus fuel productivity. And the other concern here is that of land use change, which I'll come back to in a moment. Likewise, we've got so-called second generation biofuels. These are not directly using food components as a fuel, but are using either residues, such as, say, leftover straw or other components after the grain has been removed, that can be converted into a biofuel, typically through fermentation to produce a bioethanol, or the growth of a non-food crop, such as this fast-growing woody miscanthus, so-called energy crop. But there are some issues here as well in terms of use of residues, as I've already mentioned. This is over time removing carbon from soil, and again we have issues of land use change. So let's just go into a bit more detail on some of these points. So first of all, the land use change. If we were to convert, say, some forest lands into cultivation of palm oil, which has been occurring quite substantially in parts of Southeast Asia, if we just consider the production of the benefits of greenhouse gas emissions from the palm oil biofuel, then it looks quite positive. But we do actually need to consider that the loss of carbon from the removal of this forest, so there's substantial carbon loss from this land use change, and it's been estimated that for the case of an oil palm crop, it'll take about 70 years to compensate for this initial loss of carbon through this land use change. Of course, it depends what this initial land was used for, depending on how much carbon is lost through this land use change. If it was fairly poor grasslands, the initial carbon loss is reduced, so the amount of time to compensate will be less. If it's a really carbon-rich land, let's say peatland, which is very carbon-rich, then the amount of time to compensate will be much greater. We're talking perhaps centuries, or certainly over 100 years. With regard to the second generation biofuels and this loss of residue, this is some modelling that has evaluated this component. So in the US, a lot of the biofuel legislation proposes that to be an effective biofuel, that produce must show a 6% or greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And at first glance, the generation of this biofuel does actually look quite positive in comparison to a fossil fuel. But this is without consideration in this change of the soil organic carbon through the utilisation of these residues, such as, say, a corn straw, corn stover. But in fact, we know that if or when these residues, these leftover parts of the crop, are utilised for biofuel, so when they are removed from the field, there is over time a decline in the soil organic carbon. And when we do indeed take this into account, as these different examples and models here show the saving in greenhouse gas emission is actually only fairly moderately improved, or really not improved at all, compared to the fossil fuel greenhouse gas emission. Okay, so that's carbon dioxide. That's the challenge of carbon dioxide. And, but as I said, although there's lots of components such as land use change, such as the poor utilisation of soil that will release carbon dioxide from these agriculture, there's actually these other greenhouse gases that are the major emitters due to agricultural activity. So nitrous oxide, I touched on in the last lecture. I made reference to it with regard to nitrogen cycle. So I've already introduced it to you. It's substantially emitted from agricultural activity in these soils. As I said at the start, it's a potent greenhouse gas. It has potent warming activities, and also it can drive the breakdown of ozone in our atmosphere. So not only is it a gas that can drive warming, it can also drive breakdown of stratospheric ozone. So if you remember on Thursday, I talked about the inputs of nitrogen fertiliser and other nitrogen sources onto a crop, and various routes of loss of that nitrogen, either through leaching and entry into rivers or the sea, or also the loss of nitrogen as nitrous oxide. And I talked about denitrification, and in fact there's a number of microbial routes by which nitrous oxide can be generated when nitrogen is present in the soil. And this diagram here is just illustrating these four main processes. And these different processes have differential activities depending on the type of soil, the form of soil. So when the soil is more highly waterlogged and so has a lower oxygen content, so it's more anaerobic, these denitrification activities are much greater. So if you remember, this is the conversion of nitrate into nitrous oxide, which can be substantially, can quickly emitted into the atmosphere from the soil. Although theoretically the denitrification activity can further drive the production of nitrogen gas, which of course is non-harmful. So in theory, denitrification can be harmless and give rise to nitrogen gas, but what often happens is this reaction does not occur to its endpoint, and actually you get quite substantial production of nitrous oxide in addition to some production of nitrogen gas. The other activity that's also driven by anaerobic conditions is nitrate ammonification. So this is the population of bacteria that have this activity that can drive the generation of ammonium from nitrate, and nitrous oxide is a byproduct of this reaction. And then we have two other reactions that occur in aerobic conditions. So the first one here is nitrification, or ammonia oxidation, as it's also known, which is a conversion of ammonia into nitrite, and nitrate, and nitrous oxide is again a byproduct of this reaction. And then finally we have this fourth reaction that's generated by a class of bacteria called nitrifiers, and these also have an alternative metabolism that can generate denitrification to generate, again, nitrous oxide emission, but under more aerobic conditions. So, as I said, there's various factors, various conditions that can determine increased or decreased nitrous oxide production through these microbial activities. So I've already talked about the oxygen conditions, so aerobic versus anaerobic conditions, and as I said, when the soil are more anaerobic, we're getting substantial production of nitrous oxide due to these denitrification activities. Nitrogen availability, of course, clearly is driving the activity. There's more nitrogen input into the soil. There's more substrates for the microorganisms to convert into nitrous oxide. pH is also an interesting component. So most bacteria generally prefer to survive in more neutral pH soils as opposed to acidic soils. So therefore, in less acidic soils, there's a greater bacterial population, and including those that are generating these denitrification activities, there's then greater production of nitrous oxide. But this that denitrification step that I mentioned at the start, which could also drive nitrogen gas production, that final step is inhibited at lower pH, and so under lower pHs the nitrous oxide to nitrogen ratio is higher. And then finally, carbon availability also drives increased nitrous oxide production. So when there's more carbon, particularly more carbon in a form that's able to be utilised by these microorganisms, they're then able to drive more nitrous oxide production. So this data really just clarifies this point I've already made about the greater nitrogen inputs that have been added into the soil, the greater the production of nitrous oxide. And as we've already mentioned in previous lectures, nitrogen use efficiency is pretty poor. So as nitrogen inputs are increasing onto a field, as this top graph is showing, the uptake of nitrogen into crops is starts to tail off. We're not getting a one-to-one ratio between nitrogen input and nitrogen application. Otherwise, we'll have a line here that's much steeper. What we're finding is that at increasing concentration of nitrogen, less and less nitrogen is being taken up by the plant. So much so that as the nitrogen application concentration increases, the amount of nitrous oxide emission increases as there's more nitrogen available in the soil to fuel these reactions. And indeed, we can see this if we plot this same data on the basis of a nitrogen surplus. So on this side of the graph, when we have clear positive nitrogen surplus in the soil due to excessive application of nitrogen, we're getting now really substantial emissions of nitrous oxide. So this really indicates that we need to be much more sustainable in our applications of nitrogen into our arable fields to limit this production of nitrous oxide. So clear approaches to mitigate this nitrous oxide production is to really manage the application of these fertilisers much more carefully, so that we're not overfeeding this pool of nitrous oxide production. In addition, we can increase the efficiency of the use of nitrogen by the crops that are being cultivated in these fields. So there's an increasing amount of research that's breeding different lines of arable crops which are much more efficient in their ability to utilise nitrogen, so that there's therefore less nitrogen that's remaining on the field that's not utilised. There are also other strategies that can be considered. There's chemical inhibitors that have been shown that can be added to a field that can inhibit some of these microbial activities to block nitrous oxide production. And also there's evidence that different types of plant can produce different compounds that can be exuded from the roots that can alter the composition of bacteria that are present in the soil. So some plant varieties can either promote or inhibit the accumulation of some of these bacterial communities that are responsible for either enhancing or decreasing production of nitrous oxide. And finally, just to sort of touch on now methane. It's the third greenhouse gas that's a big concern in terms of these climatic events. So naturally, a lot of methane is produced in wetland environments, this very anaerobic, waterlogged regions. There's a lot of methane production activities that go on naturally in these environments. From an anthropogenic perspective, a lot of agriculture activities are also driving methane production, and a number of the activities here, as you can see, are related to agriculture. And in fact, analysis has shown that over the last few centuries, as our agriculture has developed and increased globally, we have seen increasing emissions of methane into our atmosphere. So today we're seeing about sort of 2 to 3 times increase in methane emissions in comparison to what we saw about 500 years ago. The bulk of these emissions are through essentially 2 main routes of agricultural activity. The first is through cultivation of farm animals, and this is methane that's derived in the guts of these animals. So it's so-called enteric fermentation, which I'm going to touch on next. And then the second point, which I'm going to talk a bit about, is through agriculture, and principally rice agriculture. So, first of all, emissions from livestock. Methane generation globally pretty much matches the key sites of livestock cultivation. So, a lot of livestock cultivation in Europe, parts of America, a lot in India, very intensive cultivation of cattle, particularly in India, and this is mirroring this methane production. So these ruminant animals, so we're talking cows, sheep, goats, of course, have evolved more efficient digestive processes to utilise bacteria in their guts, in their rumen, to help them digest this plant material, this principally grass material that they are feeding on and deriving energy from. Now this grass material, it's not very easily digestible. If we eat grass, we can very poorly digest it. We're not able to break down this woody cellulosic component of the grass. And actually the cows themselves can't do it. They need this consortium of bacteria in their rumen to help them break down this material. And the bacteria help break down this plant material, convert that into other carbon components such as organic acids, as well as some other sugars. CO2 is produced, and methane is also an end product of these microbial reactions. And then a proportion of that all that methane is then emitted from that cow. The cow breathes it out. Many people seem to think that cows actually are farting methane, but they're not. They're just breathing it out as they do with the CO2. So these gases are expelled from these animals, and it's estimated that about 500 litres of methane can be produced from a cow per day. And if we think about the many billions of these ruminants that we're cultivating across our planet, all these billions of cows, sheep and goats, that's a lot of methane that's being produced per year. Can we do anything about this? Well, of course, actually there are changes to the animal husbandry that we can consider to temper this production of methane from the animals. So the nutritional quality of the feed can influence the amount of methane that's being produced. So the more nutritious the feed stock that we're giving to the cattle, the lower the methane production. But then, of course, we need to consider if we're growing fodder that's more nutritionally rich, that tends to suggest that we're adding more fertiliser to that feed crop to make it more nutritious. So we have to balance out those considerations. We've also seen that different breeds of animal can have reduced production of methane. So there are animal breeding considerations. Vaccination is one component that's interesting. So obviously this is vaccination with antibiotics that can alter the microbiome within these animals' rumen and actually attempt to reduce the proportion of the bacteria that are driving methane production. So we'll be very careful with this because these bacteria are essential to allow these animals to efficiently digest this plant material. And there are also supplements that can be given to the animals that can inhibit some of these some of this methane production. And if we just go back to this previous slide, this chemical here, this NOP, is one such methane inhibitor that can be added to cows and reduce methane production, in this particular case by about 30%. And then the other key component we need to consider with regard to methane from agriculture is through rice cultivation. So methane production in a soil environment is driven again through bacterial activity. And in fact, very similar bacterial activities that are taking place within the cow's rumen. Again, this is methanogenesis, where organic material is being converted into carbon dioxide and methane. This is principally happening in anaerobic environments within the soil, particularly where sulfate and nitrate concentrations are low, because these inhibit this methanogenic activity. So methanogenesis is actually a mixture of microbial reactions that are taking place, generated through different bacterial taxa that are acting as a community. So we have 4 key steps in methanogenesis that generate methane from initial nutrients that are present within the soil, that are derived from decaying plant or animal matter. So these carbohydrates, fats or proteins can be converted by hydrolysis into their constituent components, sugars, fatty acids or amino acids. These can then be converted into carbonic acids and alcohols, further broken down into hydrogen, CO2 and acetic acid, that can then, by this final methanogenic step, be converted into methane. And as I said, these steps are predominantly anaerobic. We also have to consider methanotrophic reactions, which will consume methane and therefore reduce the accumulation of methane. And we then therefore need to consider the net production of methane in these soils through the balance of activities of both the methanogens and the methanotrophs. So the reason that the rice paddy environment is a concern is because this is a waterlogged environment, so therefore the presence of the water is reducing the aeration of the soil and is therefore reducing the oxygen concentration in the soil, and is therefore promoting these methanogenic activities, very similar to what we see naturally in wetland environments. So we have methane generation activities taking place within the soils of these rice paddies, both associated with the roots in the rhizosphere portion of the soil and also in the bulk soil. And then this methane is able to be released into the atmosphere, either by slow diffusion through the soil and then the water column, but also particularly by entering the plant and then transversing through the plant's vascular pathway and then diffusion through these parenchyma cells of the rice plants and then into the atmosphere. And again, like with the nitrous oxide reduction, there are various factors that will increase or decrease methane production. In the case of methane production, nitrogen availability actually decreases methane production. We've already touched on the importance of anaerobic conditions to drive methane production. pH, the methanotrophs, also the methanogens have higher activity under neutral, more alkaline pHs, whereas the methanotrophs increase in activity under higher pHs. And carbon availability also drives methane production. And then sulfate and iron availability also are components to consider, both in terms of decreasing or increasing methane production. So with this in mind, we can also develop mitigation strategies. So in particular, by adding sulfate-containing fertilizers, as this inhibits these methanogenic activities, or indeed by considering breeding strategies, by choosing crop plants that can actually reduce methane production. And this is one example of that, where it's been shown that certain high-yielding varieties of rice, when grown on carbon-rich paddy soils, actually promotes more methanotrophic activities in the soil, so these methane-consuming activities, which therefore will reduce the net methane production in these paddy field environments. And finally, my last slide, again, a challenge here is that these changing climatic conditions, so these increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, has also been suggested to drive increases in nitrous oxide production and methane production, principally due to more carbon dioxide driving increased plant productivity, and then better plant productivity is driving greater microbial activities. So again, there's challenges here of positive feedbacks where, as our climate is changing, both in terms of CO2 concentrations and temperature, it's also driving these gas emissions. Okay, I'm going to end it there, and again, I've got some suggested further reading articles if you want to go into a bit more detail with some of these points. And again, the full text links have been put onto the Blackboard page. And tomorrow we're going to finish off the agriculture topic, looking at maybe some of the solutions to some of these challenges, looking at sustainable agriculture.